Thank you so much to Stella for this conference. It's an honour to speak here today and to be the only lawyer, I think, here today talking about the law. Who are we? Well, firstly, I'll introduce myself. Thanks, Sarah, for the introduction. My name is Laoise Brún. I'm a broadcast journalist by trade originally. I'm more latterly a lactation consultant. I'm also a barrister, and I'm the founder and CEO of the Countess. And all of these kind of underpin our work as an organisation. I founded the Countess 3 years ago in secret in Ireland. It was an extremely hostile environment back then. I'm happy to say things have shifted quite dramatically since then, in large part for our work on the ground in Ireland, and conversations are happening now in real life and off Twitter. Today I'm going to outline the law, the legislative and cultural capture, which is the context of that law in Ireland, the practical implications of gender, self-ID, gender ideology, and what we must do in Ireland to resist it. So briefly, who are we? Well, we're apolitical, non-partisan, we're single issue, and we're incorporated. And this is important because, you know, we're not a loose band of activists. So we have an internal structure, we're extremely disciplined about our messaging and optics. And because of that, that pays dividends then in terms of policy makers trusting us as a safe pair of hands. So in terms of our mission, we highlight the impact of trans ideology, self-ID in society, but especially on women, children, and vulnerable young people, in particular LGBT young people. And we do that much like Genspect. We provide a framework for a conversation that is measured and meaningful and mindful regarding the conflict of rights. And in order to do that, we have a very strict social media policy, an incredibly strict language policy. There's things we will say and we won't say. We're constantly evolving this. We scoped very hard at the beginning, so we're very clear on what we want to do and what we'll talk about, what we won't talk about. For example, you know, we're not going to go down any rabbit holes. Somebody may feel that everyone has a gender identity and that's their prerogative, and we respect those views. We're only here to talk about practice and policy, and never personalities. So these are our pillars of concern. We identified them at the very beginning, at the scoping outset, at the formation of the Countess. And as you can see, you know, these are all the areas of life that are impacted where sex matters and where therefore self-ID will have an impact on everyday life. We have working groups in all of these areas with the relevant expertise. And what we do is we aim to assist parents, teachers, concerned citizens by offering this framework to enable and empower them to have these conversations that they need to have. We intend to amend the Gender Recognition Act to close the gaps. It's very obvious to all reasonable people that there are real issues with allowing men to identify into female-only spaces. We intend to remove this ideology from school. I'll be talking about that in greater detail at the education panel. And we need to reverse all so-called inclusive policies. So I'm going to just talk you through the jurisprudence and the social context to how we got where we are today in Ireland. So there's two test cases that we need to focus on. There's Foy and then there's Goodwin. And they sort of interact in terms of the timeline. So Foy was a dentist who had full genital surgery, and he did actually get his passport and driver's license changed to his new female name and sex marker, but he wanted his birth cert changed as well. And actually he is refused. He fails at first instance. And the judgment by Ketchney Jays is I think so pertinent today and, you know, rather enjoyable to read actually as an activist, because he says things like, no, you know, it is actually unlike a passport, for example, a birth cert is not a reflection of one's travels through life. He also says it is in the interest of the state to keep correct birth records. He talks about the impact on the applicant's family. And, you know, this is never said in the official narrative, but, you know, Foy's family contested his application. They were not behind this whatsoever. And he also talks about the impact on women and children. And so all of those things have come to you know, they've come home, haven't they? But in the meantime, these issues were coming to court in Europe. And so the British test case, Goodwin, comes to court. And in that judgment, they talk about assuaging the distress of post-operative transsexuals. They're the judge's words. And so Goodwin is successful, but it's fought under two heads: the right to privacy and the right to marry. And the right to marry obviously becomes moot when gay marriage is brought into member states, and the right to privacy is incredibly limited in scope At no point is access to female-only spaces mentioned at all. It's not even considered. It's really to do, like FOI, it's to do with markers and names on documentation. But Goodwin is successful, and so FOI is restated, and because of the primacy of EU law, decision is made in line with Goodwin. So then there's a need for legislation, and it's a very, very typical, I must say, Irish thing that we drag our feet for 20 years and then we overcorrect. And this is what's happened here. It's my view that we've brought in legislation that goes far further than the problem we needed to solve in Ireland. And not only that, the way it happens, it's quite shocking actually when you delve into it. So initially the right thing is done. There's a problem that has to be legislated for, and a cross-party group of experts is set up, and it's called the advisory group, and they look at this problem in detail, and they essentially recommend the medical model, which many people might disagree with, but at the end of the day, it has at least some gatekeeping built into it to keep the wrong sorts of men away from this mechanism that allows them to self-ID into female spaces. So this is suggested and advised, and then 4 deputies on an Oireachtas committee make the switch. And I call that the Great Leap. It's an extraordinary switch. There's no division, so there's no vote, and there's no debate about what that means. And how they did this it was very clever. They inserted a human rights mechanism and a narrative in there. We couldn't possibly ask these men to castrate themselves, by taking cross-sex hormones. We can't do that. That would be a breach of their human rights. And that is how we got where we are. And this is where we are. It reads very much like our neighbouring jurisdiction, and it's an extraordinary piece of legislation. I was at House of Lords briefing once, and Lucy Hunter said, I've never forgotten her words, she said, "What is this? Is it a laying of hands by the state?" It's an extraordinary, you don't get a piece of paper for being gay or lesbian, but what it says as well, I would see it in very Irish terms of we've all read it, I'm sure, a million times, but your preferred gender is the male gender, the person's sex becomes that of a man. It's like, is this a magic spell? What is this? But this is what we have, and we've had it for 8 years. So looking back now, 8 years later, what can we say? What have we learned? The first thing is, far from a sort of piece of paper that does nothing and that only helps a tiny handful of distressed people who seemingly, according to the narrative, live, hermetically sealed from the rest of society and in some sort of vacuum, that's actually not what this is at all. This is a radical reordering of society. This is an immediate eradication of norms, of common sense boundaries. It's clear how that's the case, because once a man can identify into a female-only space, that space is de facto mixed sex. That's the whole point. It can and it is being abused, quite obviously, because by definition, self-ID, by definition, has no gatekeeping. That is the point of full self-ID. And looking back as well, it's clear it was only the beginning. Because at the time, the narrative we kept hearing was, we got you gay marriage, you have to give this to us, and then we'll be happy. This is what we've always wanted. That's not what happened at all, actually, looking back. I see, we as an organisation, the Countess, we look at this. What we do very well is we step back and we stand back and we compare and we analyse things. And it's very clear that, in actual fact, activists used the GRA like a flag in the sand. And it created then, from that point, there was an aggressive forward march of policies, of legislation, and a suite of bills. And all of this takes place in all self-ID jurisdictions within a context of complete cultural and institutional capture. In fact, that has to be how it works. It all kind of operates together as an ecosystem. So we've looked at all the other self-ID jurisdictions, and there's the same bills come up everywhere. You've heard Stella talk about anti-conversion therapies. We've done a lot of work on hate crime. One of our big issues with hate crime, and we've just heard actually this week in Ireland that it's about to go to the Senate, so it will happen. It will be made law, unfortunately. But the key issue with hate crime for us is not only, as a lawyer, I would say it's extraordinary because it strips away mens rea, intention, which is always necessary for a criminal act, but also that This is a public debate that needs to happen in Ireland. It's a bona fides public debate. On one side, you have gender-critical people like us. On the other side, you have trans activists and their allies. But only one side, one party, is afforded protected status under this legislation. So there's a complete lack of symmetry. And then it can be used to harass gender-critical people and their views. And therefore, the An Garda Síochána, our police service in Ireland, can be politicised. And none of those outcomes are what any society should want. But the way the suite of bills work, so anti-conversion therapies, hate crime, the amendment to the equality legislation, and the expansion of self-ID to minors, they all work together to essentially make dissent unlawful. And they have to do that because they're trying to copper fasten down what is essentially the central lie of the GRA, that this piece of legislation can magically change your sex. That has to be enforced onto the people, because otherwise it just wouldn't have credence, or people might laugh at it, or it wouldn't have the power it has. Its power as well comes from this suite of bills which essentially make dissent unlawful. And not only that, but they expand it. So it was legislated for, but then there was an immediate push to expand it downwards to children and outwards by collapsing the gender ground inequality legislation. So looking briefly, I'm not going to bore you by reading this all out, but you can see the gender ground currently in the Equal Status Act in Ireland is male or female. Now, under EU law, gender reassignment is also covered, but the gender ground in Irish law is male or female. And as you can see here, on paper, our laws are very, very robust when it comes to single-sex spaces, because it actually is an express acknowledgement for the need for intimate spaces, single-sex intimate spaces. It actually spells out, infringement of privacy, where embarrassment or privacy infringement can be expected from the presence of someone of the opposite sex. That's great, isn't it? However, as Naomi Cunningham just pointed out recently in the UK, these provisions are permissive, they're not mandatory. And I really welcome the move from Naomi Cunningham to start advocacy around that, to make service providers, mandated, to force them to make them provide single-sex spaces. Because at the moment, all it means is you cannot be sued if you discriminate based on sex. But as I mentioned earlier, if they collapse the gender ground, well then, not only can things like what's happening in California happen, where men are just accessing female-only spaces, known sex offenders, but also it means that even the basic lack of gatekeeping, but at least you have to fill out a form in Ireland currently, they won't even have to fill out a form, they'll just identify in on a whim. So it's really next level self-ID if the gender ground collapses. So in terms of the kind of landscape in Ireland, much like the UK, up until quite recently, in fact, our Human Rights and Equality Commission is completely captured to such an extent that they are telling people, they've told us, we've written to them numerous times, that gender includes trans-identified people when it does not. And what this means is then this drives policy across all sectors of society. That's in tandem with, extraordinary lobbying by trans lobby groups in Ireland, like Tenny, who, after all, get more FaceTime, have more face-to-face meetings with Irish ministers than Facebook. So this creates an uncertainty there's an uncertainty across society on what is the impact of the GRA on Equal Status Act and our equality legislation. And the European law is not particularly clear either, beyond Goodwin. So it's not settled in law. And it's in this kind of climate of uncertainty that can be exploited, essentially, by activists, and it is being exploited. And we also have an added problem of activist politicians, one infamous one we all know very well from the Green Party, who, unfortunately for us, you couldn't make this up, his portfolio includes children and equality. So he is just pumping out policy and legislation as fast as we can possibly cope to try to deal with it. But, the activist politicians, I call them the true believers, because I really do think these are the bane of our lives. These are well-meaning, progressive politicians who really do think that this is a force for good. The world will be a better place. And so all of these things together really create an ecosystem that have allowed in Ireland self-ID to flourish, to take root, but to expand its original scope as well. So there's a sort of ripple effect from that, from the legislation. You know, once you say a man can become a woman, not just legally, but magically, let's say, then, you know, that impacts all other parts of society. And all other parts of legislation must be brought in line with this. And that's why then you end up in an extraordinary situation where our language and legislation working group noticed this, buried deep in a kind of seemingly innocuous post-COVID bill. They're rushing it out. It was to do with flexi time. The workplace balance, you know, miscellaneous provisions bill sounds so harmless. But in the schemes 10, 11, 12, it was the most extraordinary, aggressive, retroactive stripping away of the word woman from primary statutory legislation in Ireland. Now, luckily, we were able to get speeches made in the Senate in Ireland. We produced a campaign called These Words Belong to Us. It seemed to hit a chord with Irish people. Our idea was, you know, Irish women intergenerationally have paid a very high price for being mothers and women in the history of our state. So these words do not belong to you, they belong to us. They don't belong to the state. And I'm happy to say that the word woman has been retained, but you know, we lost the other two heads. So sometimes in this game, it's really important to identify a win, because sometimes it's not glorious. It's not everything. But I would say that on the ground in Ireland, we at the Countess have seen, and we are inundated with whistleblowers. I would say on a daily basis, someone contacts us on one of our many platforms and says, I was just in this place and this just happened. Really scared, really terrified, upset teachers, mothers, ordinary women. And what that speaks of, we feel, is a powerful shift in paradigm. Because once you say a man can become a woman, you're blurring boundaries and you're eradicating kind of safeguarding norms. And so then you end up with this extraordinary situation where schools, we'll talk about that in more detail later, but for instance, shops. So Penneys is a very famous chain of department stores in Ireland. It's particularly popular with young girls, like 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds. And it's Primark, it's the same shop in the UK. But so they don't even have ladies' change rooms anymore. All their change rooms are mixed sex. So they've gone beyond the wildest dreams of the trans lobby groups. And they've stripped out, you know, single-sex provision altogether. And of course, immediately men are going in with their mobile phones, putting them under the curtains and uploading that footage onto Pornhub. And I myself was in Arnott's recently, which I'm happy to say still has ladies' changing rooms. So I was in the ladies' changing room buying a dress, trying on clothes, and there was a man inside the changing room. So I was like, what do I do? And I just sort of whispered to a staff member, and she said, I'll get the manager. The manager was this tiny little Spanish woman, and she was incredible. She just stormed out and she said, I have to do this every day. Every day. Every day a man goes into the changing room in Arnott's. So that is what's happening. There is a blurring of boundaries and emboldening of behaviour, which, you know, endangers women and children, frankly. And, you know, in terms of the legislation, for all purposes, this is an access. We see this in the Countess as an access area pass for predators, cheats and transgressors. You know, we're not anti-trans. We're not saying trans-identified people are predatory. We are saying it's an access all area pass. It emboldens the men who are the predators in our society. So no more do we feel this more viscerally and experience this, the most egregious impacts of this, than in prisons in Ireland. You know, the women's wing in Limerick has a capacity of 29. There's currently 3 men in there. And, you know, when the UN talk about the gentle nature of trans-identified males, you know, we at the Countess wonder, are you talking about Barbie Kardashian? Is that who you mean? The man who threatened to rape his own mother with a screwdriver and pour boiling water in her genitals, who is now currently threatening to rape female guards in Ireland, who are forced to search him. Do you mean maybe Shauna, a man who bottled another man at a pub brawl, and that man later died? Or maybe he means Prisoner X, a paedophile who raped his 4-year-old stepson for 2 years and threatened to pull off the little boy's arms and legs if he told anyone. You know, we would view this as entirely unconscionable, It must be stopped by any means possible as a matter of absolute urgency. It's a stain on the state's reputation. And there's also, in practical terms, I have to say, in terms of the law, there's a threefold risk of litigation here. Because, you know, any one of these well-funded trans library groups could take a case because the men in there are locked up 23 hours a day in breach of their the Mandela rules. Any one of them women who've been incarcerated in with them, they could take a case because their human rights have been breached. And also, you know, we've just heard that Barbara Kardashian is going to be charged with threatening to rape the prison guards. So I would love to think that one of these prison guards will come forward and take a case and sue the prison service, because that's what we need. We need test cases in Ireland. So I'm just going to continue the theme of the misinterpretation of the law and how that drives policy. Now, this is maybe the test case, but not the test case we wanted, unfortunately. And I feel like I'm going to have to gingerly kind of walk you through it and not fall into, you know, the river. Just stay on the stepping stones. But suffice to say, it's been mired and bogged down in various different injunction proceedings, contempt of court, and more latterly, Mr. Burke's brother, Simeon, has been arrested for public disorder. So there's a lot going on, there's a lot clouding the real substantive issue, which is, can a teacher in Ireland be disciplined, be fired, be suspended, whatever you want to say, we won't get bogged down, can they, for refusing to socially transition a child? And this is a really important question. So essentially what's happening in this story is the teacher writes to the entire staff room. And this is how this does play out, because I have seen one of these emails, and they're extraordinary. I'm not saying this particular email, but I've seen other emails that are sent to staff rooms. And the one I saw, which is not this case, but I'm just remembering it now because I want to tell you about it, because in the email it says, this is how you bring this up with your with the pupils, the other pupils. And you tell them, we know you're going to be kind to your classmate. We know you're not going to add to their distress. And that is an extraordinary weaponization of be kind against those children by the people who we entrust them with, the teachers. But in this case, it's more straightforward than that. There's an email exchange, essentially, from the teacher, from the school principal to Enoch Burke. I'm just going to read it out here. I've just too many things in my hands. Can you confirm to me that parents... the teacher says, this is what's happening, this is their new name, they're going to be using they, them, you know, get with the program sort of thing, I expect you will sort of thing. And he says, can you confirm to me that the parents of the student in the school, the other students, this is key, the cohort, have been told that one of their classmates is to be referred to as they, and they must now approve this by referring to the student in this manner? Has a chaplain agreed to this? I'm shocked that students in the school are being forced to accept this position. So he's essentially saying, this is an ideology, I'm not down with it, but what about the cohort? What about the classmates? And she responds, the rights of persons to be called by a name of their choosing and in accordance with their preferred gender is a recognised right, and a refusal to address persons by their preferred gender or new name has been held to constitute discrimination on the gender grounds. Now, as far as I can see, that is a very aspirational interpretation of gender assignment. Completely. You know, and then she goes on to say, in view of the school's obligations under Equal Status Act, I expect you will communicate with the student in accordance with the wishes of the student and the student's parents. And she also quotes Section 7 of the Equal Status Act. But, you know, my reading of that, it says it's simply about access to education, essentially. That's what the provision is about. So you see this footprint of the lobbying and the institutional capture, where again and again in Ireland, you see policy written based on essentially an aspirational interpretation of the law and of obligations under equality legislation that goes way beyond where we actually do stand in terms of our EU case law and also in terms of our own Gender Recognition Act. I won't go into that, but you know, it's very obviously, it's a provision around access to education. So we also have a working group on sport, and the same thing is happening in sport in Ireland. As you can see, I'll just give you a brief walk through the timeline in case you don't know. But essentially what's happened is Ladies Gaelic Football Association, it's the sister organisation of Gaelic, the ancient Irish sport. I mean, it's hard to exaggerate the kind of how how deeply this is part of the Irish fabric of society. I mean, there's clubs in every village. It's just, it sort of is who we are, really. And so essentially what happened last summer is a man called Julia, who's an Italian national living in Ireland, who, is objectively discusses, his various fetishes online and things like that. So, I mean, he's essentially a bad actor because he's playing in a ladies' junior match, and then he's advising on policy. And lo and behold, we end up with a situation where suddenly all males over 12 are allowed to play in ladies' Gaelic football in Ireland. And this is a contact sport. And when we, and the working group in the Countess, the working group on sport, when we investigate this and campaign against this, and I have to say, we've had women come to us and say, I feel like I was punched in the stomach. This is because it's run by volunteers after all. And what they say is this process ensures that the LGFA complies with its legal obligations under European and Irish law, in particular the Equal Status Act. So again, we see an absolute misinterpretation of the rights and obligations. Wait, no, where am I? So in conclusion, self-ID, these are not even my words. It was snuck in under the radar. They're the words of one of the key architects of self-ID in Ireland, a trans activist. So it has a technical effect. So it obviously impacts all other pieces of legislation. It's brought in as part of, a playbook, I would call it. So from the moment it comes into law, there's a suite of bills to enforce this ideology on the people across every sector, to expand it downwards to children, to expand it outwards via collapsing the gender grounds in equality legislation. And I would say, we would say the Countess, it has a deeper, graver, more diffuse effect as well in society because it emboldens predators and it eradicates norms. And it exists very, very much, as a kind of part of an ecosystem of cultural and institutional capture, activist politicians, and in Ireland, sadly, media blackout by and large. But what could be done? So public opinion is behind us. It's fair to say the genie's out of the bottle in Ireland. Everyone's talking about this now. And that's down to, our work and other campaigning groups as well. And they're talking about it in the pub and they're talking about it at the school gates and they're not happy. And just like the Denton report, predicted, it's deeply unpopular. And we ran a poll, the only poll of its kind in Ireland, 2 years ago now. And I dare say if we were to run it again, and maybe we should, we would actually get so much a higher figure in our favour. But even back then, 2 years ago, when the conversation was only trickling out, really only starting to trickle out about the conflict of rights, the impact on women and children and same-sex attracted young people, even then, only 17% of the public actually agreed with the falsification of birth certs without full genital surgery. So always remember that, keep that in your mind, as activists in Ireland in particular. I would say we're at a tipping point. Ireland's a very small country. In terms of, you look at our culture, we like a cohesive discourse in Ireland. It's not like big countries like the UK. And that's why I think some things do not translate to Ireland. We're post-colonial as well. But in terms of the discourse, we seem to have one big conversation at a time in Ireland. And that's why that was a weakness and it allowed them to get to where they've got to. But we can use it to our advantage because, once a critical mass are saying, actually, no, we don't want this. Test cases have been very useful in a neighbouring jurisdiction, but the rules are slightly different here around locus standi or standi. You need to have someone who's been personally impacted by the policy or the law. So the threshold is higher in Ireland, but we are looking for someone with standing. So please come forward to one of our volunteers who are wearing our t-shirts if you have been impacted by any of these policies that I've outlined. Now, I really feel like, everyone does this differently. And maybe it's because I'm a lawyer, but I think, we need to look at this in terms of legislation. And it's like, what do we want? We want to amend legislation. How will we do that? through careful, consistent brain work and very strict, disciplined optics messaging. That's not for everyone. It's really not for everyone, but that's what we do. That's the way we've decided to do this. So because of that, we are going to amend the GRA. I've personally drafted an amendment. Before anyone says, don't you want to repeal it, Leisha? Of course I do. To me, that's just a given. Don't we all want to repeal it? We all want to repeal it. But, we have to be realistic. We can't go beyond Goodwin. And, I'd like to think what I've done is elegant. It's minimalist. Gets those men out of that jail. That's an emergency. And, we need to do what they did. They never asked for everything all at once, did they? They chipped away at it. They were strategic. And that's what we will do. Thank you.